Hi everyone! Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from. YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Today I will tell a horror story.
Story 1. The Customer Who Wasn't There. I saw myself standing behind a counter in the security footage, serving coffee to a faceless customer, hours after I'd left for the night. I used to take photos of abandoned buildings, old hospitals, shuttered schools, the kind of places that feel like they're holding their breath. I'd heard about the Crescent Cafe from an urban exploration forum. It had closed 6 months ago after some kind of dispute with the landlord. No one had touched it since. Everything inside was supposed to be exactly as it was the day the doors shut for good. It was a freezing Saturday morning when I arrived, camera in hand. The sky was gray and the street was silent, except for the wind rattling a torn cafe sign above the door. The windows were so dusty I could barely see inside, but when I pulled on the door, it creaked open with a surprising lack of resistance. Immediately, I noticed the smell, like stale sugar and something rotting beneath it. My breath fogged in the chill. I started snapping pictures, chairs stacked on tables, an overturned mug on the counter, menus still written in colorful chalk. Everything looked as if the staff had just stepped out for a smoke break and never come back. I walked behind the counter, stepping over a fallen help wanted sign. There was an old espresso machine, and next to it, a register with the drawer hanging open. Out of habit, I checked to see if there were any leftover coins or scraps of paper worth photographing. That's when I noticed the cup. It was a plain white mug, sitting in the middle of the counter, right where customers used to pick up their orders. What made me stop was the steam curling up from it, fresh, hot. There was no way. My heart started pounding. I scanned the room again, suddenly aware of how alone I was, or at least how alone I should have been. The cafe was silent, but I had the uncanny feeling someone was watching me. I told myself someone must have broken in recently, maybe a squatter, maybe another explorer. But the door hadn't looked forced, and everything else was covered in a layer of dust. I snapped a few pictures of the cup, its untouched surface, and the way the steam caught the light. I kept telling myself it was some kind of prank, but the hairs on my arms wouldn't settle. Trying to shake it off, I kept exploring. I checked the back hallway, the tiny office, and the staff bathroom. Every room was empty, cold, and dark. The only sound was my own breathing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from just out of sight. I made my way back to the front, planning to leave. But as I passed the counter, something caught my eye. A movement in the corner, reflected in the stainless steel of the espresso machine. I whipped around. Nothing. That was enough for me. I gathered my things and headed for the door, but something made me pause at the security monitor mounted above the register. The screen was dusty and flickering, still powered on despite everything else being dead. It showed 4 black and white camera angles of the cafe, one from the front door, one from behind the counter, one in the hallway, and one pointed right at where I was standing. And there, in the lower left feed, I saw myself. But it wasn't live. It was a recording from last night, time-stamped 2:38 a.m., long before I'd gone home. The footage showed me, or someone who looked like me, standing behind the counter. I watched, breathless, as my double picked up the white mug, filled it from the espresso machine, and handed it across the counter to someone out of frame. But the other person, if you could call it that, was wrong. Its face was a blur, features swirling like someone had wiped them away. It reached out, fingers too long, and wrapped its hand around the cup. The me behind the counter just stood there, smiling. Then both turned toward the camera, and the screen flickered. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair. The cafe was icy cold now, much colder than when I had first entered. I could see my breath, thick and heavy, hanging in the air. Suddenly, the bell over the front door chimed, but I hadn't touched it. I spun around, expecting to see someone, anything, but the door was shut tight. That's when I heard it, a voice, faint and scratchy, coming from behind the counter. "Your order's ready." I bolted for the exit, not caring about the photos I had left behind. The front door that had opened so easily before felt stuck, like something was pressing against it from the other side. It took all my strength to wrench it open and stumble out into the daylight. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block. When I finally looked back, the cafe was just as I had left it, quiet, forgotten, completely empty. Or so it seemed. I never went back to the Crescent Cafe, but sometimes when I look through my camera roll, I find pictures I don't remember taking, blurry shots from behind the counter, and always a white mug steaming on the counter, waiting for someone to pick it up.
Story 2. Last Call at Midnight Diner. I heard the bell above the door ring, but when I looked up, nobody was there. Just the rain hammering against the glass and a single muddy footprint slowly appearing on the checkered floor. This happened 5 years ago, but I still can't pass a boarded-up diner without feeling that crawling sensation up my neck. Back then, I was 22, broke and restless, crashing at my buddy Greg's place while we drove around the outskirts of town in his battered Ford. We used to go exploring at night, sometimes for photos, sometimes just to prove we weren't as boring as our lives had started to feel. That Friday, a storm rolled in after midnight. The wind came howling down Main Street, driving sheets of rain so thick the world outside the windshield vanished. We had nowhere to be, but Greg was hyped up on cheap energy drinks, so we kept driving. When the rain got so heavy we couldn't see, we pulled off on an unfamiliar road and parked under the flickering sign of the Red Lantern Diner, a place I'd only heard about in local ghost stories. The Red Lantern had closed years earlier after a fire in the kitchen, and rumors said it was cursed. Kids dared each other to break in, but the owners never bothered to board up the windows. We watched the rain for a while, until Greg grinned and said, "Let's get out of the car. I bet we could ride out the storm in there." I hesitated. Even from the outside, the place looked wrong. The neon sign glowed sickly red in the downpour, and the windows were fogged up like someone was inside, breathing on the glass. But I didn't want to look like a coward, so I followed Greg as he pushed open the door. The bell above the door gave a cheerful ring that sounded strangely clear in the storm.
Inside, the diner was lit only by the weak glow of the sign outside, painting the white tiles pink. It smelled like burnt coffee and something sweet gone sour. Water dripped from a broken ceiling tile, making a slow, constant tapping on the floor. We shook off the rain, laughing, and slid into a booth near the window. For a while, we just talked. The storm made the world outside vanish. The only sound was the wind and the rain and the occasional tap, tap, tap of water hitting the floor. It felt almost safe, almost like any other late-night diner run. Then I heard the bell again. It was soft, but unmistakable. I looked at Greg, but he was busy scrolling through his phone. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He shrugged, probably just the wind. But then I saw it. A fresh, muddy footprint right in the middle of the checkerboard tiles, glistening as if someone had just stepped in from the storm. I stared at it, heart thumping. The print was too big for Greg's boots. I leaned forward, trying to see further into the shadows by the counter. All I could make out was the empty row of red stools and the old jukebox in the corner. A cold draft swept across the room. The scent of burnt coffee got sharper, almost bitter. The lights flickered, and the bell rang again, louder this time. Greg frowned. Okay, that was weird. We both stood up, straining to listen. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed from the kitchen. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. Just another set of footsteps closer, as if someone was walking up the aisle between the booths. Greg grabbed my arm. "Let's go." But as we turned toward the door, it slammed shut on its own with a crash so loud I felt it in my bones. The temperature dropped. My breath came out in white puffs. The bell rang once more, almost mocking. Then the jukebox crackled to life, playing a scratchy tune, some old 1950s song about heartbreak. I felt something move past me, cold and electric, making the hair on my arms stand straight up. A shadow tall and thin passed across the booths, heading for the counter. We stood frozen as the shadows seemed to flicker in the neon light, never quite solid, but unmistakably there. Greg tried the door. It rattled in its frame but wouldn't budge. I backed away, bumping into a stool. The shadows stopped by the counter, where the muddy footprints ended. The old cash register dinged, the drawer sliding open by itself. Then, in the reflection of the diner window, I saw faces, pale, staring, pressed against the glass from the outside. Dozens of them, blank-eyed, watching. The bell rang again, right above our heads. Greg screamed, and suddenly the front door flew open. The wind howled through, scattering napkins and old menus. We bolted into the rain without looking back. We never spoke about that night again. A week later, the Red Lantern was finally boarded up. I still drive by sometimes, and if I listen through the rain, I swear I can hear that bell ringing, waiting for someone else to come in for the last call. Story 3. The Locked-In Barista. I always thought I was alone during those closing shifts, until the night I heard the espresso machine start up by itself, long after I'd locked the cafe doors. I never used to believe those stories about haunted places. The old cafe where I worked, Bean Hollow, had been around forever, a cozy spot with creaky floors and walls crowded with old photos. Most of my shifts were boring, except for the occasional rowdy customer or spill. But after the place went under last winter, my manager hired me and a friend to help clear out the last of the equipment before the landlord changed the locks. We were paid in cash, told to be quick, and to stay out of the back storage room if we could help it. No one explained why. On my last night there, I volunteered to work alone. My friend bailed last minute, claiming he felt sick. Honestly, I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. I told myself I'd bring a Bluetooth speaker and get it done faster. It was already dark when I arrived, sleet tapping the windows. The parking lot was empty, the only light coming from the neon closed sign buzzing in the window. I let myself in and flicked on the overhead lights. The place looked strange without customers, like the laughter and warmth had been sucked out with the last cup of coffee. Chairs were stacked on tables, and the pastry case was empty, except for a single stale croissant. I put on my headphones, set up my playlist, and started hauling boxes toward the door. The first hour was easy. Just old mugs, battered trays, faded posters, and 1,000 coffee-stained napkins. I felt a twinge of nostalgia, thinking about all the late-night shifts and inside jokes with regulars. The clock above the register ticked past 11:45. That's when I first heard it, a faint clink from behind the counter. I paused my music, listening. The espresso machine, ancient and moody, whirred quietly to life. It hadn't worked in months. I checked the plug, still unplugged. Goosebumps prickled up my arms. I told myself it was just a noise from the pipes. But then the grinder began to hum, spitting out a few grounds onto the steel tray. The air smelled suddenly like fresh coffee, sharp and bitter. I stepped behind the counter, my shoes squeaking on the damp floor. The machine was quiet now. I reached out, half expecting it to burn my fingers, but it was cold as ice. For a second, I stared at my own reflection in the polished chrome. That's when I saw the movement, a shadow slipping across the back wall, just out of view. I spun around, heart thumping. "Hello?" My voice sounded small in the empty cafe. Silence. I tried to laugh it off. I double-checked the front door, locked tight. The window steamed with my breath as I moved around, trying to convince myself nothing was wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A few minutes later, as I packed up the last box of mugs, the overhead lights flickered and buzzed. I looked up, and every single bulb went out except for the one above the espresso machine, which glowed sickly yellow. The grinder began to whir again, louder this time. The portafilter rattled against the counter, as if someone was trying to lock it in place. I backed away, grabbing my phone. No signal. The air grew cold and damp. The clock above the register stopped at 12:06. The silence that followed was thick, heavy enough to press on my chest. Then the espresso machine let out a long, angry hiss, and steam poured out, clouding the air. Through the steam, I saw shapes, vague human outlines, gathering by the back wall, their faces blurred. I froze, unable to move, as one stepped forward, the air turning so cold my breath came in white puffs. "Why are you still here?" The voice was warped, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried the front door again. It wouldn't budge, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. My hands shook. I pounded on the glass, desperate. Behind me, the grinder whirred, and the espresso machine let out another screech. I turned back to see those figures, closer now, almost solid. Clothes wet as if they'd just come in from the sleet, faces pale and hollow. "Last call," another voice rasped. I ran for the back exit, but the kitchen door was stuck. The lights flickered again. In the glare, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the display case, only it wasn't quite me. My eyes looked sunken, my mouth twisted in a silent scream. The cold pressed in, thick and suffocating. My vision swum. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sensation of a hand gripping my shoulder, nails biting into my skin. I woke up outside, lying in the icy parking lot, soaked through and shaking. The cafe behind me was dark and silent. The closed sign was off. I never went back, and no one ever asked me to finish the job. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can smell bitter espresso in the air, and I wonder if I'd been alone after all.
Story 4. Table for one, please. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still feel the pressure of a cold, invisible hand gripping my shoulder, and remember how my own name was written in that guest book weeks before I ever set foot in that cafe. It started as a dare, like most of the dumb things I did in my early 20s. My friend Olivia was obsessed with urban exploration, dragging me to rotting theaters and abandoned fairgrounds just to see what was left behind. One night, she texted me a photo of a dusty old sign, the Cloverleaf Cafe, all are welcome. The place had been closed for over a year. Rumor was the last owner just locked up one day and never came back. Some said it was haunted. Olivia wanted us to sneak in, snap a few pictures, and maybe leave our names on the wall for the next explorers. I told her I'd meet her there after my shift. I showed up around midnight, the street empty except for my car and the cafe's flickering neon sign, which somehow still sputtered with a sickly green glow. The windows were clouded over with grime, but through the glass, I could see silhouettes of tables and chairs still set for customers who would never return. I pushed open the door, the bell above it letting out a sharp, metallic ring that seemed to echo forever. The air inside was cold and stale, heavy with the smell of wet plaster and sour milk. Every step made the floorboards groan under my weight. I called Olivia's name, but the only answer was the wind rattling a loose vent in the ceiling. My phone buzzed, a text from Olivia. "Running late. Go ahead and check it out. I'll be there soon." I sighed, trying to shake off the unease, and started wandering between the dusty booths and warped counter stools, snapping photos to prove I wasn't chicken. On a whim, I stepped behind the counter, and there, sitting open on the register, was a small, leather-bound guest book. Its pages were thick with faded blue ink, names and dates scribbled in the margins, some going back decades. Curiosity got the better of me. I flipped to the last few pages and felt my blood turn cold. The most recent entries were dated after the cafe had supposedly shut down. Even stranger, each page had only a single name, always written in shaky, unfamiliar handwriting, and always with the same date, the night that person disappeared, if the rumors were true. Goosebumps crawled up my arms as I read name after name. Local kids, a couple from the next town over. All names I'd heard before in whispered stories about people who had gone missing in the area. Then I saw it, my own name, written on the very last line. I stood frozen, staring at the ink which looked fresh and wet. I hadn't written it. I hadn't told anyone I'd be here the night, except Olivia. A sudden coldness pressed against my back, and I spun around, expecting to see Olivia grinning with her phone out. But there was nobody, just the empty cafe and the steady drip, drip, drip of water leaking somewhere behind the walls. My heart pounded. I tried to laugh it off as a prank.
This is just
Maybe
a prank,
Olivia
right?
messing with me, but I was starting to panic.
Olivia!
I grabbed my
is that
phone to
you?
call her, but my screen just flickered and died. Battery at 1%, even though I'd charged it on the drive over. I decided to wait by the door, and that's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate scrape of a chair moving in the darkness. I looked over. One of the chairs at a table in the farthest corner was sliding back, as if pulled by an unseen hand. Then the lights, what few still worked, began to dim and flicker, leaving the cafe bathed in a sickly green and yellow haze. I stood rooted to the spot, watching in horror as a cup at the far end of the counter slid off and smashed on the floor. The guest book snapped shut, its cover slamming down with a force that sent a sharp echo, bouncing through the empty room. "Table for one, please," a voice whispered, so close it felt like someone was breathing right into my ear. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the icy air and my own ragged breathing. The pressure on my shoulder grew until it felt like a hand digging into my skin. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. In the distorted reflections of the cafe windows, I saw faint, shadowy figures gathered around the empty tables, their faces blurry and twisted, all staring at me. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut, the bell giving a final mournful jingle. The lights went out, plunging everything into blackness. I felt the cold hand release me, and I stumbled forward, blindly clawing at the door until it finally gave way. I tumbled outside, gasping for air. When I looked back, the cafe was completely dark, its sign dead for the first time in years. Olivia never showed up that night. She never answered my texts again. And when I tried to go back days later, the building was gone, as if it had never existed. Sometimes, in the silence just before sleep, I hear that bell and feel that cold grip again, and I wonder how long my name will stay in that guest book, waiting for someone else, alone, at a table for one.
If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe for more.